You won't believe what happened this morning. I was enjoying my coffee on the porch, taking in the serene view of my ranch under the clear blue sky, when I spotted a small convoy of vehicles approaching. A shiny SUV led the procession, followed by two pickup trucks filled with what appeared to be surveying equipment. Before I could even set my mug down, a woman with an immaculate bob haircut and designer sunglasses marched up my driveway like she owned the place. This property has been designated for our HOA's upcoming off-road event this weekend, she announced, not even bothering with a greeting. I nearly choked on my coffee. The audacity was almost impressive if it weren't so infuriating. If you've ever dealt with someone who thinks rules don't apply to them, leave a comment below letting me know where you're watching from. Trust me, you'll want to stick around for how this showdown unfolded. I took a measured breath and set my coffee down. "Good morning to you too," I said, keeping my voice level despite the irritation bubbling beneath the surface. "I'm Marty, the owner of this ranch, and you are—" The woman barely acknowledged my question, instead gesturing broadly across my property as her companions began unloading equipment from their trucks. "I'm Harriet Johnson, head of the Community Events Committee for Pinewood Estates HOA." She replied with the air of someone announcing royal lineage. "Our annual charity off-road event needs more space this year, and this unused land is perfect. We'll need access starting Thursday for setup." I blinked slowly, wondering if this was some elaborate prank. My ranch had been in my family for generations, and it certainly wasn't part of any homeowners association, let alone unused land. The property bordered national forest land, which made sense given my position as a federal ranger, a fact Ms. Johnson was clearly unaware of. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said, stepping down from my porch. "This ranch isn't part of Pinewood Estates. It's private property, and I haven't authorized any events here." Harriet, or Karen as I was already mentally nicknaming her, narrowed her eyes above her designer sunglasses. "All land in this sector falls under HOA jurisdiction according to our revised bylaws," she stated, reaching into her leather portfolio to retrieve a document. "We've already secured preliminary approval from the township for temporary use permits." She thrust a paper toward me that looked official at first glance, but was actually just a standard application form with a signature scrawled at the bottom. I examined it carefully, noting it referenced a different property parcel altogether, one that was indeed part of their development, about half a mile down the road. "This permit application is for Lot 254B, I pointed out. "My property is designated as Rural Agricultural Land, Parcel 118A. It's not even in the same zoning district as your HOA." The two men who had accompanied Karen paused their unloading, exchanging uncomfortable glances. Karen snatched the paper back, barely glancing at it. "That's a clerical error. The intent is clear. The HOA board has unanimously approved use of this space, and we expect your cooperation." Her tone carried the unmistakable weight of someone accustomed to getting their way through sheer force of will. I crossed my arms, feeling a strange mix of annoyance and amusement. In my years as a federal ranger, I'd dealt with plenty of entitled individuals who believed rules were flexible for them, but rigid for everyone else. "I'll need to see documentation proving this property falls under your HOA jurisdiction," I said reasonably, because according to county records and my deed, it absolutely doesn't. Karen's perfectly lined lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. One of her companions, a middle-aged man in a polo shirt with the HOA logo, stepped forward. "Mrs. Johnson, perhaps we should verify the property boundaries before proceeding," he suggested cautiously. Karen shot him a look that could have frozen lava. "I don't need to verify what I already know, Thomas. The easement rights clearly extend to this area." She turned back to me, her patience visibly thinning. "We're prepared to offer a nominal fee for the inconvenience, of course. The event brings significant positive attention to the community." I shook my head firmly. "This isn't about money. This property includes protected wetland areas and serves as a wildlife corridor. It's not suitable for off-road vehicles, regardless of compensation." This was true, though I was leaving out the part about my professional responsibilities in protecting such land. Karen's expression darkened as she realized I wasn't going to be easily bullied. "We have permits pending with the city," she declared, her voice rising slightly. "Perhaps you'd prefer to discuss this with our attorney instead of forcing us to take official action." The threat hung in the air between us, as subtle as a sledgehammer. I maintained my calm exterior, though internally I was already mapping out exactly how this would play out if she pushed further. "I'm always happy to review legitimate documentation," I replied evenly. "Feel free to have your attorney contact me, but until then, please remove your equipment and vehicles from my property." Karen stared at me for a long moment, clearly unaccustomed to resistance. Finally, she snapped her portfolio closed with an audible crack. "We'll be back with the proper paperwork. The HOA has rights you clearly don't understand." As she turned to leave, she added over her shoulder, "This event is happening with or without your cooperation. It would be easier for everyone if you simply acknowledged our authority in this matter." I watched as they reluctantly loaded their equipment back into the trucks, Karen barking orders the entire time. As their vehicles disappeared down my driveway, I couldn't help but smile to myself. If she only knew who she was dealing with, she might have approached this differently. I walked back to my porch, picked up my now cold coffee, and pulled out my phone. It was time to call my former partner at the Federal Ranger Station, Jack Williams. He'd recently been promoted to regional supervisor and would find this situation both concerning and darkly amusing. "Jack? It's Marty. You're not going to believe what just happened," I began, settling into my chair. As I recounted the confrontation, Jack's hearty laugh came through the speaker. "Some people never learn," he said when I finished. "Want me to send over the federal land designation paperwork? Might save you some hassle when they come back." I grinned, picturing Karen's face when she discovered exactly who she was trying to bully. "That would be perfect," I replied. "I have a feeling this is just getting started." The morning after Karen's unwelcome visit, I surveyed my property with renewed appreciation for what was at stake. This 120-acre ranch had been in my family for 3 generations, purchased by my grandfather after World War II. What made this land special and legally protected was its location adjacent to federally managed forest land, serving as a crucial wildlife corridor for several endangered species. The eastern boundary, where Karen wanted to run off-road vehicles, was particularly sensitive habitat under a conservation easement that specifically prohibited such activities. I had my suspicions about Karen's sudden interest in my land. 2 years ago, the Pinewood Estates developer had approached my father about buying part of our property for expansion. Dad refused, citing the conservation easement. After his passing last year, when I took over, rumors circulated that the HOA was trying to expand their jurisdiction through a vague community integration clause in township codes. I called my colleague Jack for insight. "They're desperate for space," he confirmed. Their usual event location was sold to an organic farm co-op. Karen promised the HOA board and sponsors she'd secure a better location this year. She's running for HOA president next month. Delivering this would guarantee her victory. I sighed. So, I'm just collateral damage in her campaign for HOA presidency. Fantastic. Jack laughed. "Pretty much. But, I've emailed you the federal paperwork showing your ranch's protected status and documentation about the Swainson's hawks nesting on your property. They're protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, giving you additional federal backing." I thanked him and organized the documents into a comprehensive file. If Karen wanted to play hardball, she'd face not just me, but federal environmental protection laws. The next morning, I spotted Karen's convoy approaching, this time with reinforcements including an attorney in an expensive suit. "Mr. Richardson, I'm Jeffrey Palmer, legal counsel for Pinewood Estates HOA," he announced, handing me a thick folder of carefully curated HOA bylaws and permits. "Properties adjoining Pinewood Estates are subject to community integration regulations," he explained, pointing to highlighted text. After reviewing their documents, I responded with 3 crucial facts. First, my property doesn't adjoin Pinewood Estates. There's a 1/4-mile buffer of county land between us. Second, This property is under a federal conservation easement as part of the Wildlife Corridor Protection Program. I saved the most important point for last, producing my federal ranger identification and badge. Third, I monitor this protected habitat as part of my duties as a federal ranger with the Department of Interior. The silence that followed was deeply satisfying. Karen's triumphant smile froze as the implications sank in. "You're a federal ranger?" she managed, her voice losing its authority. I nodded. 15 years of service. My jurisdiction includes the adjacent national forest land, and part of my responsibility is ensuring protected habitats remain undisturbed. I handed them documentation about the Swainson's hawk nesting sites. These birds are protected under federal law. Any disruption during nesting season carries significant penalties. Palmer began backpedaling immediately, but Karen wasn't ready to concede. "The permits we've applied for should override these conservation concerns for a temporary charitable event," she insisted. I shook my head. "Federal wildlife protection laws aren't subject to override by township permits, Ms. Johnson." As their convoy departed, I called Jack. The attorney backed down when he saw the federal paperwork, but Karen threatened to use local officials to override the protections. Jack sighed. "I'll alert the Environmental Protection Agency. If she tries to pull strings, we'll be ready." 3 days passed without further incident, and I began to hope that perhaps Karen and the HOA had finally accepted reality and found an alternative location for their off-road event. That fragile hope was shattered when I received a certified letter from the township offices. Inside was a notice of temporary easement approval for the eastern portion of my property, precisely the area containing the most sensitive wildlife habitat. The letter referenced an obscure township code that allegedly allowed for temporary community use of private land in cases of significant public benefit. At the bottom was the signature of Township Supervisor Nathan Smith, a local politician I'd never met personally but knew by reputation as someone whose decisions often favored developers and business interests over environmental concerns. I immediately called the township offices and requested a meeting with Supervisor Smith, only to be told he was unavailable until next week, conveniently after the scheduled weekend of the off-road event. The receptionist, however, did let slip that Karen Johnson had been seen meeting with Smith several times over the past week. The pieces were falling into place. Unable to win through legitimate legal channels, Karen had resorted to leveraging political connections, perhaps even offering campaign donations or other incentives to secure Smith's cooperation. This wasn't just about an off-road event anymore. It had become a matter of potential corruption and abuse of power. I reached out to Jack again, explaining the new development. His response was immediate and reassuring. "This is actually good news, Marty," he said, surprising me. "Smith has overstepped his authority by trying to override federal protections. That's not just wrong, it's potentially illegal if he did so knowingly." Jack promised to contact the regional EPA office and have them issue an immediate cease-and-desist order to the township. Meanwhile, I decided to do some investigating of my own. Through a neighbor who served on a township committee, I learned that Karen's husband was a significant contributor to Smith's last campaign, and that Smith's brother-in-law owned one of the construction companies frequently contracted for HOA projects. The web of connections suggested this wasn't Karen's first time using influence to get her way. The following morning, I was preparing my formal response to the township notice when I spotted the now familiar convoy of vehicles approaching my property. This time, there were even more of them. Karen's SUV, several pickup trucks loaded with what appeared to be event equipment, and behind them a truck towing a trailer filled with off-road vehicles. My heart sank as I realized they were bypassing discussion altogether and proceeding as if they had legitimate authorization. I quickly called Jack to update him on the situation while grabbing my badge, official ID, and a cease-and-desist order he'd emailed over last night. By the time I reached my front gate, Karen was already directing workers to begin unloading equipment. "Ms. Johnson," I called out firmly, approaching with my badge visible, "I need to speak with you immediately." Karen turned, and I could see the momentary flicker of uncertainty in her eyes before she recovered her composure. Mr. Richardson, we have township approval for our event, she stated loudly, clearly performing for the benefit of her crew. Supervisor Smith signed off on the temporary easement yesterday. If you attempt to interfere, you'll be obstructing a legally permitted activity. She gestured to one of her associates, who handed her a copy of the same notice I'd received. I took a deep breath, maintaining my professional demeanor despite the provocation. I'm aware of Supervisor Smith's notice. However, I need to inform you that it has been superseded by federal authority. I presented the cease-and-desist order from the EPA, watching as Karen's expression shifted from confidence to disbelief. This document prohibits any activity that might disturb the protected wildlife habitat on this property, specifically citing the township's attempted override as invalid under federal environmental law. Karen snatched the document from my hand, her eyes scanning it rapidly. "This is ridiculous," she spluttered. "Our event is for charity. We're raising money for local schools. Are you really going to block a children's fundraiser because of some birds?" The shameless attempt to paint me as the villain might have been amusing if it weren't so manipulative. Several of the workers had paused their unloading, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating situation. "The charitable nature of your event doesn't exempt it from environmental laws, Ms. Johnson," I explained calmly. "I've previously offered to help identify alternative locations that wouldn't violate federal protections. That offer still stands." Karen crumpled the cease-and-desist order in her fist, her face flushing with anger. "Do you have any idea how much we've invested in this event? The sponsors, the advertising, the equipment rentals? We can't just move it at the last minute." I maintained my composure despite her escalating tone. "Those are business decisions you made without securing proper permission from the actual property owner. That's not my responsibility to fix." One of the crew supervisors approached Karen, speaking quietly. "Mrs. Johnson, if there's a federal order, we really shouldn't proceed. Our company can't risk those kinds of penalties." Karen's frustration boiled over as she realized her crew was wavering. "Fine," she snapped, throwing the crumpled cease-and-desist order to the ground. "This isn't over, Richardson. Supervisor Smith will hear about this federal overreach. We have significant supporters in this community who won't appreciate your obstruction." As she stormed back to her vehicle, she called over her shoulder, "Pack it up, we're leaving. For now. But don't think this is finished." I watched as the convoy grudgingly turned around, equipment still loaded on their trucks. Once they disappeared down the driveway, I picked up the discarded order and smoothed it out, taking a photo of the site to document that they had attempted to proceed despite being served with the notice. Later that afternoon, I received a call from Jack. "You might want to turn on the local news," he suggested, an unusual note of amusement in his voice. I flipped on the television to find Karen giving an impassioned interview outside the Pinewood Estates Community Center. "A federal employee is abusing his power to block a charitable community event," she declared dramatically. "This is a perfect example of government overreach interfering with local community activity." The reporter, looking appropriately concerned, asked if she had considered alternative locations. Karen's expression tightened momentarily before she regained her media-friendly smile. "We're exploring options, but with the event scheduled for this weekend, this last-minute obstruction has put us in an impossible position." I couldn't help but laugh at the creative spin she was putting on the situation. The last-minute obstruction had been my repeated assertion of property rights from the very beginning, not to mention federal environmental protections that had been in place for decades. The reporter, to his credit, noted that the property in question contained protected wildlife habitat, though he didn't mention my role as a federal ranger. Karen quickly redirected, emphasizing the charitable nature of the event and the disappointment of local children if it were canceled. It was masterful manipulation, and I realized the battle was shifting from legal ground to public opinion. Karen was attempting to paint herself as the community champion and me as the heartless bureaucrat. I called Jack back after watching the segment. "She's trying to win in the court of public opinion now," I said, concerned about the potential backlash. Jack remained unworried. "Let her try. We have something better than public sympathy. We have the law on our side." And speaking of which, I've got some interesting news about those Swainson's hawks on your property." His tone suggested he'd found something significant. Turns out, the Regional Wildlife Survey identified not just a nesting pair, but evidence that they're raising young. That elevates the protection level considerably. I'm having the updated documentation sent over tonight. If Karen tries to push this further, she'll be facing potential criminal penalties, not just civil ones. I smiled as I hung up. Karen might be good at manipulating public perception, but she was about to learn that federal wildlife protection laws didn't bend to public relations campaigns. The morning after Karen's news appearance, I woke to find my inbox flooded with emails from local residents. Some expressed support for my protection of wildlife, while others, clearly HOA members influenced by Karen, accused me of being anti-community and suggested I should be ashamed for blocking a charitable event. The local community Facebook group had apparently erupted in debate overnight, with lines clearly drawn between environmental advocates and those loyal to the HOA leadership. What struck me most was how effectively Karen had reframed the narrative, transforming her attempted appropriation of private property into a story about federal obstruction of community goodwill. I was considering how best to respond when my phone rang. It was Lisa Chen, a reporter from the regional newspaper known for her environmental coverage. "Mr. Richardson," she began after introducing herself, "I understand you're at the center of a dispute with Pinewood Estates, HOA, regarding their planned off-road event. Would you be willing to provide your perspective?" "I'm working on a more in-depth piece than what's been covered in local news," I agreed immediately, recognizing the opportunity to present the facts that Karen had so conveniently omitted from her public statements. Within an hour, Lisa arrived at my ranch, notebook and camera in hand. Unlike the local TV reporter, she asked detailed questions about the property's environmental significance and requested to see the documentation regarding the protected species. I gave Lisa a tour of the property, showing her the wetland areas that would be damaged by off-road vehicles and pointing out the nesting site of the Swainson's hawks, visible from a safe distance through binoculars. She took photographs and careful notes, particularly interested in the conservation easement documentation and the cease-and-desist order. "So, to be clear," she summarized as we finished the tour, "the HOA never had legal rights to this property, attempted to proceed anyway after being informed of its protected status, and then sought political intervention through Township Supervisor Smith to override federal environmental protections?" I nodded, appreciating her succinct summary of the situation. That's precisely what happened. And now they're portraying themselves as victims of government overreach rather than acknowledging their attempted appropriation of private property and violation of wildlife protection laws. Lisa's article appeared online that afternoon, with the print version scheduled for the next morning. The headline read, "Protected Wildlife Habitat at Center of HOA Event Controversy. Federal Ranger Defends Endangered Species Against Development Pressure." The piece was thorough and balanced, but the facts themselves were damning for Karen and the HOA. Lisa had included quotes from wildlife experts about the importance of preserving nesting habitats, citations of the relevant federal laws, and even a statement from the EPA confirming that township authorities could not override federal environmental protection. Most significantly, she'd uncovered and reported the financial connections between Supervisor Smith, Karen's husband, and the HOA's contracted construction companies, raising questions about potential conflicts of interest in Smith's decision to issue the temporary easement. Karen's response was swift and furious. By evening, she had organized an emergency meeting of HOA members at the community center. Through a neighbor who attended out of curiosity, I learned that Karen had characterized Lisa's article as a hit piece, full of technical misrepresentations designed to undermine community unity. She proposed a new strategy. If they couldn't use my property for the main event, they would instead use the road bordering my ranch for the start/finish line and staging area, technically staying off my property while still creating significant disruption. "Richardson can't stop us from using public roads," she reportedly declared to enthusiastic applause from her supporters. "We'll show him and his federal friends that this community won't be bullied." This new approach was clever but still problematic. The road in question was indeed public, but it was a narrow country lane never intended for large events. More importantly, the noise and commotion of a major gathering right at the property edge would still disturb the nesting hawks, potentially causing them to abandon their young. I called Jack immediately to discuss this development. "She's determined, I'll give her that," he mused after hearing the plan. But using that road for an event of that size would require county permits for traffic management, safety provisions, noise ordinance exceptions, none of which they have time to secure before the weekend. He paused thoughtfully. "Let me reach out to the county transportation department. They should know about this potential safety hazard." The following day brought news that vindicated our concerns. The county transportation department issued a public safety notice declaring that the narrow road bordering my property was unsuitable for organized events due to limited width, lack of shoulders, and inadequate emergency vehicle access. Furthermore, they stated that any attempt to use the road for a large gathering without proper permits would result in immediate intervention by county authorities. Karen's backup plan had been effectively blocked through legitimate safety concerns, without ever needing to invoke the wildlife protection angle. Sometimes bureaucracy worked in favor of the right outcome. That afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. Thomas, the HOA member who had accompanied Karen on her first visit to my property. He looked uncomfortable as he stood on my porch, hands shoved deep in his pockets. "I'm not here officially," he began, glancing back at his car as if worried about being seen. "I just wanted you to know that not everyone in the HOA supports Karen's approach to this situation." He explained that many community members were uncomfortable with the increasingly aggressive tactics and the potential legal exposure for the HOA. "She's invested so much of her personal reputation in making this event happen that she can't back down now. But some of us are worried she's crossing lines that could have serious consequences for the whole community." Thomas's visit confirmed what I had suspected. Karen's crusade had less to do with the charitable event and more to do with her personal ambitions within the HOA. "What's her next move likely to be?" I asked, offering Thomas a seat on the porch. He sighed heavily, accepting the chair. "She's called another emergency meeting for tonight. Rumor has it she's secured private land about 5 miles away as an alternative site, but she's still talking about organizing some kind of protest at your property boundary, something about showing solidarity against federal overreach. Most of us just want to move on and hold the event elsewhere, but Karen seems determined to make a point." I thanked Thomas for the information, assuring him I had no ill will toward the HOA members themselves, only concern about the environmental impact and the principle of property rights. After Thomas left, I received an email from Lisa Chen with an advance copy of her follow-up article, scheduled to run tomorrow. It detailed the county's safety concerns about using the border road and included statements from several unnamed HOA members expressing discomfort with the escalating situation. Most significantly, it referenced a newly discovered memo from Supervisor Smith's office, indicating he had been explicitly informed about the federal protections on my property before issuing the temporary easement, a potential violation of ethics rules if not laws. Karen's crusade was beginning to have consequences beyond her initial expectations, and I couldn't help but wonder if she would finally recognize the need to back down gracefully. Thursday morning, just 2 days before the scheduled event, I was awakened by the sound of vehicles on my driveway again. This time it wasn't Karen and her HOA entourage, but a team from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, responding to Jack's request for an emergency habitat assessment. The team leader, Dr. Eleanor Winters, explained that they would be documenting the Swainson's hawk nesting site and assessing the potential impact of various disturbances on the breeding pair. This will provide definitive scientific evidence regarding buffer zones needed to protect the nesting site, she explained as her team set up monitoring equipment. If there's any question about whether activities on adjacent land might constitute harassment of protected species, our data will provide the answer. While Dr. Winters and her team worked, I received a call from the county sheriff's office. Deputy Garcia, whom I knew professionally from my ranger duties, wanted to give me a heads up. "We've received a permit application for a demonstration at the junction where your access road meets the county road," he explained. "Harriet Johnson filed it an hour ago, claiming it's a community solidarity gathering to support local charity events. Thought you should know, since it seems connected to your ongoing situation with the HOA." I thanked him for the information, impressed but not surprised by Karen's persistence. She had finally found a legal avenue to make her point. A public demonstration just outside my property. It was petty, but technically within her rights, assuming she kept the gathering within permit guidelines. By midday, Dr. Winters had preliminary findings to share. "The hawk pair is indeed actively nesting with young chicks," she confirmed, showing me footage from their high-resolution cameras. "Based on established protection protocols, we recommend a minimum 750-foot buffer zone around the nest, where no disruptive activities should occur." She traced a circle on the map of my property that extended well beyond my boundary line in the direction of the county road, precisely where Karen planned to hold her demonstration. Any sustained loud noise or increased human activity within this zone during the nesting period could constitute harassment under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which carries significant penalties to me by evening, which would include these buffer recommendations with full scientific justification. I immediately called Deputy Garcia back with this new information. While he understood the wildlife concerns, he explained that the sheriff's office couldn't deny a legally filed demonstration permit based on potential wildlife disturbance without an official order. However, he suggested that if I could secure an emergency protective order from a federal judge based on the Fish and Wildlife Assessment, they would enforce it. Jack, when contacted, was already one step ahead. "I anticipated something like this," he said. "I've already briefed our legal team. Once we have Dr. Winters' official assessment, we can file for an emergency buffer zone enforcement order. Judge Rawlins is on call for environmental matters this week, and she takes wildlife protection very seriously." True to his word, by Thursday evening, Jack had secured an emergency order from Judge Rawlins establishing a legally enforceable protection zone around the hawk nesting site based on Dr. Winters' assessment. The order explicitly prohibited gatherings, demonstrations, or activities likely to create sustained noise or disturbance within the scientifically established buffer zone, which, conveniently, included the exact location where Karen had planned her demonstration. Deputy Garcia received the order and called to confirm the sheriff's office would enforce it if necessary. "We'll have deputies on site to ensure compliance," he assured me. "Wildlife protection orders from federal judges aren't optional." Friday morning brought the inevitable confrontation. I was speaking with Dr. Winters about her team's overnight monitoring when Karen's SUV screeched to a halt at my gate. She stormed up the driveway alone, waving a document that I presumed was the emergency order. "What kind of manipulative stunt is this?" she demanded, her voice shrill with frustration. "You manufactured some bird emergency to block our community demonstration? This is harassment." Dr. Winters stepped forward, her professional credentials visible on her lanyard. "Mrs. Johnson, I presume?" "I'm Dr. Eleanor Winters with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. The buffer zone is based on scientific assessment, not personal preference. The Swainson's hawks are a protected species with young in the nest. Federal law is quite clear about disturbance during this critical period." Karen was momentarily taken aback by the unexpected expert witness, but quickly recovered. "Convenient timing, isn't it? The one weekend we need to use this area, suddenly these hawks become critically sensitive." Dr. Winters maintained her professional composure. "Actually, this time of year is precisely when they are most sensitive. The young have hatched but aren't yet able to fly. Abandonment due to human disturbance now would be fatal to the offspring. The 750-foot buffer is actually conservative compared to recommendations for some other protected raptor species." Karen glared at me, her frustration palpable. "Our event is tomorrow. We've invested thousands of dollars, have sponsors committed, and families counting on this. You've manipulated the system to shut us down completely." I maintained my calm, professional demeanor despite her accusations. "Ms. Johnson, I've offered from the beginning to help identify alternative locations for your event. You've chosen to ignore those offers and instead attempted to appropriate private property, circumvent federal wildlife protections, and when all else failed, organize a demonstration specifically designed to disrupt protected habitat. These aren't the actions of someone genuinely concerned with community benefit. Karen's face flushed deeper red, and for a moment I thought she might actually stamp her foot in frustration. Instead, she turned abruptly and stormed back to her SUV, calling over her shoulder, "You haven't heard the last of this. The community deserves to know what kind of obstructionist you really are." As her vehicle disappeared down my driveway, Dr. Winters turned to me with a bemused expression. "Is she always this dramatic?" I sighed, watching the dust settle. "Unfortunately, yes, and I suspect this isn't over yet." How right I was. Within hours, Karen had posted a lengthy diatribe on the community Facebook page detailing her version of events and calling for community members to stand up to federal bullying. She announced that the HOA would be holding an emergency press conference that afternoon to address the ongoing harassment and obstruction of their charitable event. The lines of battle were being drawn ever more clearly, and Karen was committing fully to her narrative of victimhood, regardless of the facts. By Friday afternoon, Karen had organized an emergency press conference outside the Pinewood Estates Community Center. From the live stream, I could see she'd gathered about 24 supporters, strategically positioned to make the crowd appear larger. 3 local news crews covered the event, unusual for a local issue, and evidence of Karen's skill at manufacturing controversy. For weeks, we have attempted to work cooperatively with Mr. Richardson to use a small portion of his unused land for our annual charity off-road event, Karen began, her voice conveying calculated indignation. At every turn, he has blocked our efforts, eventually calling in federal authorities to shut down even a peaceful community gathering near his property. She emphasized the event's charitable purpose, disappointed children, and the financial burden of relocation. This is a clear case of federal overreach and obstruction of community activities. Of course, she conveniently omitted her repeated attempts to appropriate private property, her manipulation of local officials, and the necessity of protecting endangered wildlife. I was considering my response when Lisa Chen from the regional newspaper called. "I'm watching this press conference. Would you like to provide a statement?" I chose to focus on facts rather than engaging in a direct public confrontation. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has confirmed active nesting of protected Swainson's hawks on my property. Federal law establishes clear guidelines for buffer zones during critical nesting periods. I've offered multiple times to help identify alternative locations that wouldn't threaten protected wildlife. Those offers were repeatedly rejected in favor of attempts to circumvent environmental protections. This isn't about obstructing community events. It's about upholding laws designed to protect our shared natural heritage. As the press conference concluded, Karen announced a new location for the event, a privately owned field 7 miles away. "While we're disappointed by the forced relocation, the Pinewood Estates community will not be deterred from our charitable mission," she declared, positioning herself as the community champion, overcoming unjust obstacles. The cameras captured exactly the image she wanted, a dedicated volunteer persevering despite bureaucratic opposition. Later that evening, Lisa's balanced article appeared online, including my statement, context about wildlife protection laws, and comments from Dr. Winters confirming the scientific basis for the buffer zone. Jack called with a proactive suggestion. The EPA would issue a formal statement clarifying the legal basis for the protection order, and he'd arranged for a National Geographic wildlife photographer to document the hawk nesting site the following day. Miguel Sanchez arrived early Saturday morning and captured stunning images of the Swainson's hawks tending to their young. By midday, his photos had gone viral on social media with thousands of supportive comments about wildlife protection. One particularly striking image of a hawk returning to its nest with food carried the caption, "This is what was worth protecting." The narrative was shifting from Karen's story of bureaucratic obstruction to a compelling conservation success. Meanwhile, the relocated off-road event proceeded with lower attendance than anticipated. Karen maintained her public persona of triumphant leadership, but behind the scenes, sponsors questioned their investments, and HOA board members worried about potential legal exposure from Karen's documented attempts to violate federal wildlife protections. That evening, Lisa called with significant news. Township Supervisor Smith had quietly withdrawn his support for the temporary easement, citing new information about federal wildlife protections. Additionally, several HOA board members were meeting to discuss potential liability concerns. The tide was turning against Karen's crusade. Sunday morning was suspiciously quiet. No vehicles, no emails, no Facebook posts from Karen. My instinct that she was planning something was confirmed when Thomas called. Karen called an emergency executive session last night, excluding board members sympathetic to your position, he explained quietly. She's convinced a small group to approve funds for a lawsuit against you, the EPA, and the Fish and Wildlife Service, claiming conspiracy to obstruct legitimate community activities and deliberate infliction of financial harm. Even more concerning, Thomas revealed, she's calling state representatives, claiming federal agencies are overstepping their authority. She's trying to get someone with political clout to intervene on behalf of the HOA. This was a significant escalation, attempting to transform a straightforward matter of wildlife protection into a broader political issue about government authority. When I briefed Jack, his response surprised me. She's overplaying her hand, he said confidently. A lawsuit would require discovery, exposing all her communications, including any evidence of improper influence with Supervisor Smith. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act is federal law superseding state authority. She's creating a paper trail of her own attempts to circumvent environmental protections. Jacques explained that the EPA had been documenting Karen's persistent attempts to violate wildlife protections. If she files this lawsuit, we'll counter with an official cease-and-desist order naming her personally, not just the HOA. That would make her individually liable for any further interference with protected habitat. By Monday morning, Karen had indeed filed the lawsuit, naming me as primary defendant with federal agencies as co-defendants. The complaint was filled with emotive language about abuses of federal power while omitting all mention of property rights or environmental protections. The sympathetic local TV station framed it as local community standing up to federal bullying. The federal response was swift. By Monday afternoon, Karen had been personally served with a cease-and-desist order from the EPA, stating she would be individually liable for any further actions threatening protected species. Simultaneously, the U.S. Attorney's Office announced it was reviewing evidence of potential violations of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which carried substantial penalties. These serious federal actions shattered Karen's support within the HOA. An emergency board meeting was called to discuss their legal exposure. Several board members are furious, Thomas reported. Karen misrepresented her actions as having full board approval when many decisions were made unilaterally. There's serious talk of demanding her resignation. On Tuesday, the HOA board issued a public statement formally withdrawing the lawsuit, explicitly disavowing Karen's actions as exceeding authorized board directives and not reflective of the organization's commitment to legal and environmental compliance. They apologized for any disruption to protected wildlife and pledged to implement environmental impact assessments for future events, a complete reversal and public repudiation of Karen's leadership. Karen responded with a hastily recorded video on her personal social media, her composure visibly cracked as she portrayed herself as the victim of internal politics and external pressures. She announced she was temporarily stepping back from leadership, framing as voluntary what had actually been demanded by the board. The final blow came Wednesday when Lisa Chen published an award-winning investigative piece revealing Karen's husband's business connections to Supervisor Smith's brother-in-law's construction company, which stood to gain contracts for preparing my property. Lisa had uncovered emails between Karen and Smith discussing mutual benefits of approving the temporary easement, raising serious ethical questions. By Wednesday evening, Supervisor Smith had announced an independent review of his permitting procedures, attempting to get ahead of an inevitable ethics investigation. The HOA, under new leadership, reached out about organizing a wildlife conservation workshop, suggesting my participation as a federal ranger with expertise. Their transformation from adversary to potential partner was remarkable, if somewhat opportunistic. 2 weeks after the conflict reached its peak, I received an unexpected visitor. Karen herself stood on my porch, looking considerably less polished than during her media appearances. She had come alone, without the entourage or the self-righteous indignation that had characterized our previous interactions. "May I speak with you?" she asked, her voice lacking its usual commanding tone. Curious about this development, I invited her in, offering coffee, which she declined with a shake of her head. We sat in my living room, the spectacular view of the protected meadow and forest visible through the large windows, the same landscape she had been so determined to fill with off-road vehicles. "I've been asked by the board to personally apologize for my actions," she began, her discomfort evident. They felt a written statement was insufficient given the extent of the situation. She paused, clearly struggling with the humbling position in which she found herself. "I also wanted to apologize for myself. I became fixated on making the event happen at your property, even after learning about the legal and environmental issues. It was inappropriate." The admission clearly cost her considerable pride, and I found myself unexpectedly sympathetic despite everything she had put me through. Karen had built her identity around being the effective, take-charge community leader who made things happen through force of will. Having that identity publicly dismantled must have been genuinely painful. "The board has accepted my resignation," she continued, her voice steadier now, "and the County Ethics Commission has opened an investigation into my communications with Supervisor Smith. My husband's business is also being scrutinized for potential improper influence." She looked directly at me for the first time since arriving. "I'm not here to ask for your help or sympathy. I made choices that have consequences, but I did want you to know that I've been doing a lot of reflecting on why I became so fixated on this particular battle. It wasn't really about your property or even the event itself." This unexpected moment of self-awareness caught me off guard. I had been prepared for more justifications or perhaps a subtle attempt to enlist my support in minimizing the fallout, not genuine introspection. "What was it about then?" I asked, genuinely curious. Karen sighed, looking out at the landscape that had become the battlefield for our conflict. "Control, I suppose? Validation? I've built my reputation on being the person who makes things happen in the community. When you refused the use of your property, which was your right, it became a challenge to my self-impeach. I couldn't accept being told no, especially by someone I initially dismissed as just a private landowner without connections or influence." She gave a small, rueful laugh. "Learning you were a federal ranger should have been my cue to back down gracefully. Instead, I doubled down because admitting defeat felt impossible." This moment of honesty created an unexpected connection between us. Not friendship, certainly, but a human recognition of the complex motivations that drive behavior, even deeply problematic behavior. "Thank you for coming here," I said sincerely. "It couldn't have been easy." Karen nodded, rising to leave. At the door, she paused. "The new board leadership is serious about that wildlife education program, by the way. If you're willing, it could be a positive outcome from this mess." I assured her I would consider it, watching as she walked to her car without the commanding stride that had characterized her previous visits. Sometimes, I reflected, the most satisfying resolution wasn't seeing an adversary thoroughly defeated, but witnessing them come to terms with their own actions. The following month brought significant developments. The County Ethics Commission's investigation resulted in Supervisor Smith's censure and mandatory ethics training, though he managed to avoid removal from office by claiming he had been misled about the nature of the property in question. Karen's husband's construction company lost its preferential contracting status with the township, resulting in significant financial impact, and Karen herself, according to Thomas's updates, had moved into a quieter role within the community, focusing on small-scale beautification projects rather than high-profile events. The consequences had been proportional to the transgressions. substantial but not destroying, allowing for the possibility of learning and redemption. As for my property and its protected inhabitants, the Swainson's hawks successfully fledged their young, with Miguel's photographs documenting the entire process for his National Geographic feature. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service used the incident as a case study in their training materials about buffer zone enforcement, and Jack reported that several other rangers had successfully cited our experience in similar conflicts throughout the region. The educational program with the HOA did eventually materialize, with over 50 community members attending a workshop about local wildlife and conservation efforts. Even a few former Karen supporters participated, their curiosity overcoming their previous alignment. Perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the subtle shift in community perception about environmental protections. What Karen had tried to frame as burdensome federal overreach came to be understood by many local residents as necessary safeguards for shared natural heritage. Lisa Chen's follow-up articles documented increasing interest in wildlife-friendly landscaping practices among Pinewood Estates homeowners, and the HOA even established a conservation committee to review potential environmental impacts before planning community activities. Not everyone was converted, of course. Some still grumbled about bird bureaucracy, but the prevailing attitude had shifted noticeably toward recognition of conservation value. 6 months after the conflict, as I watched a new pair of Swainson's hawks exploring nesting sites on my property for the upcoming breeding season, I reflected on the entire experience. What had begun as a simple assertion of property rights and wildlife protections had evolved into a complex examination of community politics, personal ambition, and the challenge of balancing human activities with environmental responsibility. Karen had been wrong in her methods and many of her assumptions, but her core desire to create engaging community experiences wasn't inherently misguided, just misdirected and pursued through inappropriate means. The following spring, the HOA held their charity off-road event at a properly zoned and environmentally assessed location well away from sensitive habitat. Attendance was reportedly higher than any previous year, with the controversy having inadvertently raised the event's profile. I even received an invitation, which I accepted out of curiosity and as a gesture of community reconciliation. The event was well organized, with clear boundaries to minimize environmental impact, and even an educational booth about local wildlife sponsored by the new Conservation Committee. As I watched families enjoying the activities, I spotted Karen helping at the registration table, a much reduced role from her previous position as central organizer and spokesperson, but she was participating nonetheless, gradually finding a new place within the community she had both served and misled. Sometimes the best outcome isn't completely defeating your opponent, Jack commented when I described the scene to him later. It's watching them learn to channel their energy in more constructive directions. I had to agree. The ranch remained protected, the hawks continued to nest undisturbed, and the community had developed a more nuanced understanding of environmental stewardship. Even Karen had experienced consequences proportional to her actions while retaining the opportunity to redirect her considerable organizational talents toward more appropriate goals. Justice, I reflected, sometimes looked less like total victory over an adversary and more like the establishment of a healthier balance, a lesson worth remembering for future conflicts, both personal and professional. So if you ever find yourself facing someone who seems determined to claim what isn't theirs, remember my experience. Stand firm on your rights, document everything, know the relevant laws, and be prepared for a battle on multiple fronts: legal, public opinion, and perhaps even political. But also remember that behind every Karen is a person driven by complex motivations, and sometimes the most satisfying resolution comes not from crushing defeat but from creating the conditions for everyone to move forward more wisely. Thanks for reading my story. I'd love to hear about similar experiences you've had standing up for what's right in the face of entitled behavior. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real-life dramas and the lessons they teach us.